You ever deal with an HOA that thinks they own the air you breathe, the ground you walk on, and even the water that's been on your family's land for generations? Well, I have. And let me tell you, when they decided my private lake was their personal sewer, they kicked a hornet's nest they never saw coming. They actually tried to sue me for what they did, if you can believe the audacity, and then had the gall to sue me again when their own mess came back to haunt them, quite literally. It all started, as these things often do, with a change in the neighborhood. My property, which includes the entirety of Miller's Lake, has been in my family for over a century. The lake isn't some grand, sprawling body of water, but it's decent-sized, spring-fed, and until recently, pristine. It's the kind of place where dragonflies dance over the water lilies in the summer, and the mist hangs heavy on cool autumn mornings. My great-grandfather built a small, sturdy dam with a manually operated sluice gate at the far end, not for power, but to manage the water levels for irrigation on what used to be farmland and to prevent downstream flooding during heavy rains. Those water rights, meticulously documented, came with the land, a responsibility I took seriously. For years, the area around the lake was sparsely populated, just a few old farmhouses and plenty of woods. Then came Serenity Cove Estates, a brand new, high-density housing development that sprung up like a crop of particularly invasive mushrooms on the parcel of land directly abutting the eastern edge of my property, the part where the land sloped conveniently downwards towards my lake. The developer had clear-cut a massive swath of trees, crammed in as many beige-colored houses as legally permissible, and topped it all off with an iron-fisted homeowners association. From the moment their welcome packet, full of glossy photos and passive-aggressive rules, landed in my mailbox by mistake, I had a bad feeling. Their marketing material even featured unauthorized, artfully angled photos of my lake, as if it were a communal Serenity Cove amenity. I let that slide, thinking, well, they're just trying to sell houses. I had no idea what was brewing. The first hint that something was seriously wrong came not as a dramatic event, but as a subtle, unpleasant shift in the air. A faint, tangy odor that wasn't the usual earthy scent of the lake and woods. I'd be out on my porch, enjoying my morning coffee, and my nose would twitch. At first, I blamed it on unusual weather patterns, maybe a dead animal somewhere deep in the woods. But the smell persisted, and then worsened, especially after a light rain. Then I started noticing other things. A weird, slick sheen on the water in the cove closest to the Serenity Cove development. The vibrant green algae I was used to seeing in small, healthy patches started to look different. Darker, slimier, and the fish. I'm no avid fisherman, but I'd occasionally see them jumping or spot base lurking near the old submerged log. There seemed to be fewer of them, and one morning I found 3, then 5, then a dozen belly up near the shore, their silvery sides pale against the increasingly murky water. My heart sank. This wasn't natural. This was pollution. My first thought, absurdly, was that maybe some barrels had fallen off a truck on the distant highway and something had leached into the groundwater. But the problem was too localized, too concentrated near the new development. I started walking the perimeter of my property along their boundary line more frequently. They'd put up a cheap chain-link fence, as if to demarcate their sterile world from mine. It was during one of these patrols, after a particularly pungent evening, that I found it. Tucked away in a dense thicket of overgrown brush right on their side of the fence, so hastily concealed it was almost laughable, was a pipe. Not a small drainage pipe. This was a serious, industrial-looking PVC pipe, at least 10 inches in diameter, aimed directly towards my lake. It wasn't there a few months ago. My blood ran cold, then hot. There was a dark, damp stain on the ground beneath its opening, and the soil leading down the slight incline to the water's edge was unnaturally dark and rank. There was no mistaking that smell up close. It was raw sewage. I felt a wave of nausea, quickly followed by a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. My lake, my family's legacy, their toilet. I'm generally a calm person, a believer in dialogue, but this was a profound violation. I immediately took photos, videos, documented the location, the time, the weather conditions. I then, very carefully, donned gloves and a mask I kept for dusty projects, and took a sample from the trickle that was still seeping out of the pipe. I also took a water sample from the lake itself, near the outflow, and another from the far, clean side as a control. I have a friend who works in a university lab, and while she couldn't do an official analysis without a mountain of paperwork, she agreed to run a few discrete tests for me, looking for coliform bacteria and other telltale markers of human waste. The results, a few days later, were unequivocal. The pipe was discharging untreated sewage. The lake water near the pipe was heavily contaminated. Even my great-grandfather, a man of simple means but stern principles, would have been spinning in his grave. He'd taught my grandfather, who taught my father, who taught me. You don't foul your own nest, and you certainly don't foul your neighbors. The Serenity Cove HOA, it seemed, had missed that particular lesson in civility. Before going full scorched earth, I decided to try the diplomatic approach, though every fiber of my being screamed for something more dramatic. I figured, maybe it's a rogue contractor, a mistake, something the HOA board themselves weren't aware of. Oh, how naive I was. I looked up the HOA president, a woman named Carol Jenkins, whose signature was on that glossy welcome packet. I called the management company number listed and requested a meeting. Carol, when she finally called back, sounded like she was doing me an immense favor by even gracing me with her voice. We arranged to meet at the boundary line, near the offending pipe. I arrived a few minutes early, evidence photos in hand, water sample results summarized. Carol arrived late, in a golf cart, wearing an expression that suggested she'd rather be undergoing a root canal. She was a woman of a certain age, with a helmet of rigidly sprayed blonde hair and an air of unshakable, unwarranted superiority. "So," she began without preamble, not even a hello, "what's this urgent matter that couldn't be an email?" Her tone was one of profound irritation. I pointed to the pipe. "That," I said, keeping my voice level, "is discharging raw sewage into my lake. It's coming from your development." I showed her the photos, the discoloration, the dead fish. I explained the lab results in simple terms. Carol stared at the pipe, as if it had personally insulted her. She then gave a dismissive little sniff. "That's impossible," she declared, without even bothering to look at my evidence. "Serenity Cove Estates has a state-of-the-art, fully permitted septic system. It's inspected regularly." I pressed. "With all due respect, Miss Jenkins, that pipe is not state-of-the-art, and it's definitely not septic. It's a direct, illegal discharge. It's poisoning my lake, killing the wildlife, and frankly, it's a massive health hazard." She crossed her arms, her lips pursed into a thin line of displeasure. "I think you're mistaken," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "It's probably just storm runoff, maybe some leaves and, natural detritus. Lakes get dirty sometimes. Natural detritus." The sheer unadulterated audacity of it almost made me laugh. "Miss Jenkins," I said, my patience wearing dangerously thin, "I know the difference between leaves and human excrement. This needs to stop immediately, and the damage needs to be remediated." She actually scoffed. "Remediated? Don't be dramatic, and I'm not admitting to anything. If you have a problem with natural processes, perhaps you should consider better maintenance of your pond." She waved a dismissive hand towards my lake. "Frankly," she continued, puffing herself up like an adder, "we at Serenity Cove are a little tired of the, shall we say, rustic nature of your property dragging down our aesthetic. Perhaps you should focus on that, instead of making baseless accusations." That was it. The gloves were off. The rustic nature of my property, the one her HOA was actively polluting. The sheer, unmitigated gall. I looked her dead in the eye. "This isn't a discussion about aesthetics, Miss Jenkins. This is about a criminal act. That pipe needs to be removed, and the discharge stopped within 48 hours. If it's not, I'll be forced to take further action, including reporting this to the EPA and the county health department." Her eyes narrowed. "Are you threatening me?" "Because I assure you, Serenity Cove has excellent legal representation. We don't take kindly to harassment from disgruntled neighbors." Disgruntled. That was rich. I was beyond disgruntled. I was on the verge of volcanic, but I held my composure. "Consider it a promise, not a threat," I said, my voice low and steady. 48 hours. I turned and walked away, leaving her sputtering by the chain-link fence. The arrogance was breathtaking. They weren't just polluting, they were proud of it, or at least utterly indifferent to the consequences for anyone but themselves. As I walked back to my house, the image of my great-grandfather's dam and the old cast-iron wheel that controlled the sluice gate flashed into my mind. He'd always said, "Control the water, son, and you control a lot more than just the water." For the first time, I began to understand the deeper implications of his words. The HOA had started a war. They just didn't realize I had a rather significant piece of artillery they hadn't accounted for. The 48-hour deadline was, of course, a bluff in terms of immediate, magical solutions, but it was a line in the sand. I knew they wouldn't lift a finger. People like Carol Jenkins don't respond to reason. They only respond to overwhelming force or public humiliation, and I was beginning to formulate a plan that might just provide both. The fight for Miller's Lake had begun. The 48 hours passed, predictably, without so much as a whisper from Carol Jenkins or the Serenity Cove HOA. The illegal pipe continued its disgusting trickle, a constant, stomach-churning reminder of their contempt. I hadn't really expected them to cap it. Their arrogance was too deeply entrenched. But their silence, their utter lack of acknowledgement, solidified my resolve. This wasn't just about a polluted lake anymore. It was about principle. It was about a group of entitled bullies thinking they could waltz in, destroy a century-old legacy, and face no consequences. My first official step was to contact the county health department and the state environmental protection agency. I meticulously documented everything. Dates, times, photographs, video footage of the discharge, the lab results from my friend, which I presented as preliminary findings pending official tests, and a detailed account of my conversation with Carol Jenkins. I sent it all via certified mail, return receipt requested, and followed up with emails and phone calls. The initial responses were underwhelming. Bureaucracy, as you probably know, moves at a glacial pace. I got a lot of "we'll look into it" and "your complaint has been logged." It felt like shouting into a void. I knew I couldn't rely solely on them for a swift resolution. While I waited for the official gears to grind, the HOA, perhaps emboldened by my lack of immediate visible retaliation after the 48-hour mark, seemed to double down. The trickle from the pipe became a more consistent, albeit still relatively small, flow. It was as if they were testing me, pushing the boundaries. And then the petty harassment began. Suddenly, I started receiving official-looking violation notices from the Serenity Cove HOA management company. One was for overgrown vegetation visible from the Serenity Cove common area, referring to the trees on my property that had been there for 50 years. Another was for a dilapidated structure, which I could only assume was my great-grandfather's old fishing shed. A charmingly weathered little building well within my property lines, and nowhere near their precious beige boxes. There was even one for unpleasant odors emanating from property, the irony of which was so thick you could spread it on toast. Each notice came with a demand for immediate rectification and a threat of fines. It was clear Carol Jenkins was trying to intimidate me, to bury me in paperwork and nuisance complaints, probably hoping I'd get tired and give up on the sewage issue. Little did she know, she was only fueling my fire. I responded to each ridiculous notice, calmly and factually, pointing out that their jurisdiction ended at my property line and that their claims were baseless. I also made sure to CC my growing file on their illegal dumping with each response. Let them see I wasn't forgetting the real issue. During this period, I immersed myself in research. I pulled out the old deeds to my land, the original surveys, and every document I could find related to Miller's Lake and its water rights. My great-grandfather had been remarkably thorough. The documents clearly stated that the owner of my parcel held exclusive rights to the lake bed, the water column, and the control structures, namely the dam and sluice gate. It even specified the right to manage water levels for the health and preservation of the lake and downstream environs. This was gold. I also started documenting the HOA's activities with even more rigor. I invested in a couple of motion-activated wildlife cameras and discreetly positioned them with a view of the illegal pipe and the area around it. I wanted irrefutable, time-stamped evidence of the ongoing discharge. The footage I captured was damning. It showed the flow varying, sometimes stronger, sometimes weaker, but always present. Occasionally, I'd even capture glimpses of what looked like maintenance workers from Serenity Cove poking around the area, never touching the pipe to stop it, but clearly aware of its existence. It was as if they were checking on their little secret sewer outlet. One evening, I was reviewing the footage, the familiar knot of anger tightening in my stomach, when an idea began to form, a wild, audacious idea that made me sit bolt upright. The sluice gate. My great-grandfather's dam. I had the right to manage the water levels. The Serenity Cove development, in their infinite wisdom and cost-cutting construction, had built their homes on the lowest lying land, adjacent to the lake, the very land that naturally sloped towards it. Their own engineers must have noted the floodplain, but I suspect the developer, eager to maximize profits, had fudged the reports or simply ignored the risks. What if the lake level were to rise? Not catastrophically, not enough to endanger anyone upstream or far downstream, but just enough to say, make the area around their illegal discharge pipe rather saturated? Enough, perhaps, for their own filth to find its way back to them. The thought was deliciously ironic. It was a David versus Goliath scenario, and I was starting to realize my slingshot might be a bit more powerful than I'd initially thought. I wasn't an engineer, but I had a good practical understanding of how the sluice gate worked. It was a simple mechanism, a large, heavy steel plate that could be raised or lowered using a geared wheel. Lowering it would restrict the outflow, causing the lake level to rise. Raising it would allow more water to escape, lowering the level. For decades, it had been kept at a fairly consistent setting, maintaining the lake at its usual picturesque level. But there was nothing legally preventing me from adjusting it, especially if I could argue it was for the health and preservation of the lake. Say, by diluting the concentrated sewage near their discharge point by raising the overall water volume, or by attempting to flush the system. The more I thought about it, the more perfect it seemed. It wouldn't be me dumping anything. I would simply be managing my water, as was my right. If their poorly planned development and their illegal sewage pipe created a problem for them when the water level changed, well, that was hardly my fault, was it? It was their actions creating the hazardous material. I would just be facilitating its return to sender. I started to make calculations. I studied the topography maps I had. I observed the drainage patterns during rain. I needed to be precise. I didn't want to flood my own property, nor did I want to cause widespread damage that could lead to legitimate legal trouble for me. My target was specific. The low-lying homes of Serenity Cove, the ones closest to the lake, the ones most likely to be owned by the HOA board members who were so blithely ignoring my complaints. Carol Jenkins's house, I recalled from the county plat maps I'd obsessively studied, was prime lakefront real estate in their development, built on a slight pad but still alarmingly close to the natural floodplain. Oh, the beautiful karmic symmetry of it all. I even consulted very discreetly with an old college buddy, Mark, who was now a civil engineer. I didn't tell him the whole sewage saga, just framed it as wanting to understand the hydrodynamics of my lake and dam better, perhaps for future restoration projects. He gave me some general principles about flow rates, water pressure, and soil saturation, which confirmed that my basic idea was sound, provided I was careful. He also, quite helpfully, mentioned how older, unpermitted discharge points often lack backflow preventers, meaning if the external water level rose above the pipe's opening, a reverse flow was entirely possible. My smile at that piece of information was probably a little too predatory for a simple query about lake restoration. The petty notices from the HOA continued to arrive, like clockwork. Failure to maintain a visually appealing shoreline. Excessive noise from wildlife, birds chirping too loudly, presumably. It was almost comical. They were so focused on their campaign of nitpicking harassment, so convinced of their own invincibility, that they remained completely oblivious to the far more significant problem they were creating for themselves, and the rather elegant, watery solution I was brewing. I was patient. I gathered my evidence. I planned. I waited for the right conditions. The EPA and Health Department were still investigating, which meant I was essentially on my own for any immediate action. And as the autumn rains began to set in, I knew my window of opportunity was approaching. They had sown the wind, or rather, the sewage. They were about to reap the whirlwind, or in this case, a very localized, very personal flood. The meticulous planning phase was, in its own way, quite satisfying. It was like preparing for a complex chess match where I knew my opponent's every weakness because they'd so flagrantly displayed them. My target was precise. I wanted the rising waters of Miller's Lake, now, unfortunately, but necessarily tinged with Serenity Cove's own special blend of effluent, to gently, but firmly make their presence known in the lowest lying sections of their development. Specifically, I envisioned their illegal sewage pipe becoming submerged, and then, thanks to Mark's helpful insight about the lack of backflow preventers on such shoddy, clandestine installations, for the lake water, their lake water really, to reverse course right back up that pipe and into whatever collection system or sumpit originated from within their pristine community. The poetic justice was almost too beautiful to contemplate. I spent weeks observing. I noted the typical lake levels, the outflow rate through the sluice gate in its normal position. I walked my property line daily, gauging the soil saturation, the way rainwater ran off. I even, and this might sound a bit over the top, but you have to be thorough, I even built a small rudimentary clay model of the lake's edge and the Serenity Cove floodplain in my workshop, using topographical maps and my own observations to get the contours as accurate as possible. I'd then pour water into my mini lake and watch how it would spread if the outflow was restricted. It was crude, but it helped me visualize the potential impact and calibrate my intentions. I needed enough water to make a statement, to cause significant inconvenience and expose their hypocrisy, but not so much as to cause a genuine disaster that could bring down serious legal repercussions beyond what I was prepared to handle, or worse, harm uninvolved parties. The key was the sluice gate. It was old, heavy, and hadn't been fully closed in probably 50 years. My great-grandfather had kept it meticulously maintained, a habit my father and I had continued, greasing the gears, checking the seals. It was stiff, but it would move. I practiced weigh, adjustments, noting how much a quarter turn of the large iron wheel impacted the outflow. It was a delicate balance. I also had to consider the timing. A sudden, inexplicable rise in the lake level on a perfectly dry day might look suspicious, even though I had the right to do it. But if the lake were to rise during a period of sustained, heavy autumn rain, well, that would just be nature, wouldn't it? People would attribute it to the weather. And if some poorly sited homes near a lake that was known to have a dam happened to get a bit damp, that would be seen as unfortunate, perhaps, but not necessarily malicious. The fact that the dampness might have a distinctly sewage-like aroma would be a problem for Serenity Cove to explain, not me. As autumn progressed, the rains started. Not torrents at first, but the steady, soaking rains that saturate the ground and begin to swell the streams and aquifers that fed Miller's Lake. The lake level naturally began to creep up, as it always did in the fall. This was perfect. My actions would merely accentuate the natural process. I kept a close eye on the weather forecasts. I needed a good, solid period of rain, enough to provide cover for the rising waters, but not a hurricane that would cause widespread, uncontrollable flooding everywhere. The universe, it seemed, was on my side. A forecast came in for a solid 3 to 4 days of persistent, moderate to heavy rain. This was my window. The day before the rains were predicted to start in earnest, I made my final preparations. I double-checked the sluice gate mechanism. I cleared some debris from the outflow channel downstream of the dam, far away from Serenity Cove, just to ensure there were no unexpected blockages on my end that could cause water to back up onto my own property more than anticipated. I felt a strange mixture of calm and exhilaration. It was the feeling of a long simmering injustice finally about to be addressed. There was a brief moment, I'll admit, where I questioned the extremity of it. Was I going too far? But then I'd remember the dead fish, the stink, the oily sheen on the water, Carol Jenkins' sneering, dismissive face, and the endless stream of petty violation notices. They had left me no other recourse. They had refused dialogue, denied facts, and responded to my legitimate concerns with contempt and harassment. They had fouled my nest, and now their filth was about to boomerang. The night before the rains began, I couldn't sleep much. I kept replaying the plan in my head, checking the variables. My great-grandfather's words echoed again. Control the water, and you control a lot more. He probably never envisioned this particular application of his wisdom, but I felt he would have approved of standing up to bullies. The next morning, the sky was a uniform, depressing gray. The first drops began to fall as I was finishing my coffee. It started as a drizzle, then steadily increased to a persistent, soaking rain. Perfect. I donned my heaviest rain gear, grabbed a powerful flashlight, and headed out to the dam. The old iron wheel was cold and wet to the touch. It took considerable effort to get it to turn, groaning in protest after years of relative inactivity, But slowly, painstakingly, I began to lower the sluice gate, not all at once. I did it incrementally, maybe an inch or two of closure every few hours over the first day of rain. I'd go out, make an adjustment, then retreat to my house to observe, monitor the lake levels against a marker I'd set, and check the weather radar. The lake was indeed rising, slowly but surely, a combination of the heavy rainfall and the restricted outflow. The rain was relentless, drumming on the roof, turning my yard into a series of small rivulets, all heading towards the lake. By the end of the first day, the water level was up by about 6 inches. Still well within normal flood variation for a heavy rain period, but higher than it would have been without my intervention. The illegal discharge pipe from Serenity Cove was still above water, but the ground around it was becoming increasingly saturated. On the second day, the rain continued unabated. I continued my incremental adjustments to the sluice gate. Another few inches of closure. The lake was now visibly swollen. The water was lapping at the very edge of the manicured lawns of the Serenity Cove lakefront properties. I could see, through binoculars from my vantage point on higher ground, that their fancy new drainage grates were already struggling to cope with the surface runoff from their own paved streets and compacted soil. They'd stripped away all the natural absorption when they'd built the place. Their state-of-the-art infrastructure wasn't looking so smart now. By the afternoon of the second day, the moment I'd been waiting for arrived. The lake water, now a murky, unpleasant brown from all the runoff, and of course the ongoing sewage contribution, finally reached and then submerged the opening of the illegal PVC pipe. I watched, a grim satisfaction settling in. Phase 1 complete. Now it was just a matter of hydrostatic pressure and their lack of a backflow preventer. I gave the sluice wheel another small, deliberate turn downwards. Just a little more restriction, a little more encouragement for the lake to share its contents. The moral calculus was clear in my mind. This wasn't my sewage. I wasn't creating the hazard. I was merely ensuring that the people responsible for the hazard were the first to experience its unpleasant consequences. It was, in essence, a highly targeted, environmentally specific intervention. And if they hadn't been illegally dumping, the rising lake water would just be water. It was their own actions that had weaponized it. The thought of Carol Jenkins waking up to find her manicured lawn squishy and her basement perhaps a tad fragrant was, I confess, a motivating factor. She and her HOA had shown nothing but contempt for my property and my rights. It was time they experienced a little bit of what it felt like to have your personal space violated by something foul and unwanted. The rain was my accomplice, the lake my instrument, and their own malfeasance was the ammunition. All I was doing was conducting the orchestra. The third day of rain was the crescendo. The downpour was relentless, a steady, gray curtain that showed no signs of stopping. Miller's Lake had transformed. It was no longer a placid, welcoming body of water. It was swollen, angry, and a rather disturbing shade of brown, a testament to the runoff from the surrounding land and, of course, the special contributions from Serenity Cove. From my higher ground, through a pair of high-powered binoculars, I had a front-row seat to the unfolding drama. The illegal discharge pipe from Serenity Cove was now completely submerged, invisible beneath several inches of murky lake water. And the water was still rising, albeit slowly, thanks to my judicious management of the sluice gate. I wasn't aiming for a catastrophic flood, just a persistent, undeniable, and deeply unpleasant encroachment. By mid-morning, I started to see the first signs that my little hydrostatic experiment was working as intended. The lawns of the lowest-lying Serenity Cove homes, particularly those directly inland from where their sewage pipe entered the lake, were no longer just soggy. They were visibly waterlogged. Small pools were forming, And these pools weren't just rainwater. There was a telltale sheen, a slightly darker, more viscous quality to them. I couldn't smell it from my distance, thankfully, but I could imagine. Oh, I could definitely imagine. Then came the first real visual confirmation. I saw a man, one of the Serenity Cove residents, come out onto his back patio, which was now alarmingly close to looking like a boat dock. He was gesticulating wildly, pointing at his lawn, then at the lake. He bent down, poked at something on the ground, and recoiled, shaking his hand in disgust. I allowed myself a small, grim smile. It appeared the special delivery was arriving. Reports, or rather, panicked shouts and frantic activity, started to become evident. I saw more people emerging from their homes, staring in disbelief at the encroaching, odoriferous water. Several were on their phones, presumably calling the HOA management, the city, perhaps even a priest. The beauty of it was its deniability, from my perspective. It was raining heavily. Lakes rise when it rains heavily, especially when their outflow might be naturally impeded by debris, or, in this case, a deliberately but legally adjusted sluice gate. If their properties were flooding with what smelled suspiciously like sewage, well, that was a Serenity Cove problem, wasn't it? They were the ones with the state-of-the-art septic system that apparently wasn't performing so well under pressure. Perhaps their own internal plumbing or collection sumps were backing up due to the saturated ground and the now blocked and backflowing illegal discharge point. The irony was exquisite. The very pipe they were using to pollute my lake was now acting as a conduit for that same polluted water to re-enter their pristine development. I saw a golf cart, undoubtedly carrying the esteemed Carol Jenkins, zipping erratically along the sodden pathways between houses. She stopped near the worst affected area, got out, took one look, and I could almost feel her apoplectic rage radiating across the water. She was waving her arms, her blonde helmet of hair somehow impervious to the drizzle, her face a mask of fury. Good. Let her feel a fraction of the frustration and disgust I'd been living with for months. Around noon, I saw a couple of Serenity Cove maintenance workers in bright yellow rain slickers arrive with a portable sump pump. They tried to deploy it near one of the flooded lawns, but it was like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. The water they were pumping out was just being replaced by more seepage. And where exactly were they pumping it? If they pumped it towards the lake, they were just adding to the problem. If they pumped it onto other parts of their property, they were just spreading the joy. It was a losing battle for them, and they seemed to realize it quickly, retreating in soggy defeat. The rain finally began to taper off late in the afternoon of the third day, though the sky remained dark and menacing. The lake had reached its peak level, exactly where I'd calculated it would be most effective without being overly destructive to areas beyond my target. The lowest sections of Serenity Cove were a mess. Lawns were inundated, patios were islands, and I could only imagine the state of their crawl spaces and basements if they were foolish enough to have them on a floodplain. And it wasn't just water. It was their own diluted, but still potent, sewage. The visual evidence was undeniable, even from a distance. The color, the way it clung to the grass, the debris. The next morning, the fourth day, dawned gray but dry. The lake was still high, a vast brown expanse. The full extent of the inconvenience at Serenity Cove was now clearly visible. Several homes had water right up to their foundations. There were work crews, not just HOA maintenance, but actual disaster restoration vans, parked on the drier streets. People in hazmat-type suits were milling about. The atmosphere over there was one of crisis, and, predictably, of blame. Later that day, a sheriff's deputy actually came to my door. He was polite but firm. "Sir, we've had some complaints from the Serenity Cove HOA about flooding. They seem to think you might have something to do with the lake levels." I feigned mild surprise. Flooding? Oh, that's terrible. Yes, the lake is very high after all that rain. It happens. In fact, my great-grandfather built that dam precisely to help manage high water events, though primarily to protect downstream areas. I've just been ensuring it's functioning as intended, making sure the outflow isn't blocked by storm debris. Responsible lake management. The deputy nodded. They mention you control the dam. I do, I affirmed. It's my property and my right, stipulated in the deeds for over 100 years. Been in the family that long. We always keep an eye on it during heavy weather. The primary concern is always safety downstream, preventing a sudden surge if the natural outflow gets blocked and then gives way. I was being truthful, just not entirely complete. He asked if I deliberately raised the water to flood them. Deputy, I said with my most earnest expression, why on earth would I do that? That sounds malicious and, frankly, dangerous. My only action has been to ensure the dam is secure and the sluice is clear of any major obstructions that could cause a catastrophic failure or unexpected downstream surge from a debris dam breaking. With this much rain, the lake is going to rise significantly regardless. If their homes were built too close to the natural floodplain, or if their own drainage systems failed, that's an issue for their developers and engineers, not for me. I'm just managing my property responsibly, as I always have. I even showed him the old deeds and some literature about responsible dam ownership I'd conveniently printed out from the internet. He seemed satisfied. There was no evidence I'd done anything illegal. I was managing my water on my land. The fact that Serenity Cove had built on low ground and was simultaneously and illegally discharging sewage into the lake, which then got returned to them. Well, that was a complex situation, largely of their own making. The deputy left, and I watched him go, a sense of grim satisfaction washing over me. The HOA had wanted a fight. They just hadn't anticipated the battlefield or my choice of weapons. The best part was, I hadn't dumped a single drop of anything into their property. The lake water, adulterated by their sewage pipe, had simply risen and through the magic of backflow, revisited its source. Now, it was time to let the lake slowly recede. I began to gradually, very gradually, open the sluice gate a little more each day. The waters in Serenity Cove would recede, leaving behind a very fragrant and very expensive mess for them to clean up. And I had a feeling the lawsuits wouldn't be far behind, though perhaps not the ones they were anticipating. The aftermath in Serenity Cove was, from what I could gather, a chaotic and exceedingly smelly affair. The waters receded slowly over the next week as I gradually opened the sluice gate further, allowing Miller's Lake to return to its more normal level. But what was left behind in those low-lying areas of the HOA was a slimy, grayish-brown residue, a lingering perfume of their own malfeasance, and a hefty cleanup bill. The disaster restoration vans were a fixture there for weeks. I saw workers in full hazmat gear pressure-washing driveways, ripping out saturated carpets and drywall from the affected homes, and deploying industrial-sized dehumidifiers. The cost must have been astronomical. And the finger-pointing, oh, the glorious finger-pointing. Through the local grapevine, small towns are wonderful for that. I heard that the Serenity Cove residents were furious, primarily with their HOA board, led by the indomitable Carol Jenkins. Their pristine, state-of-the-art community had literally been inundated with its own filth. The lakefront premium they'd paid for their properties suddenly seemed like a very bad investment. Of course, Carol and her board weren't about to take responsibility. Their first move, entirely predictably, was to try and pin it all on me. About a month after the Great Sewage return, I was served with a lawsuit. Summons, complaint, the whole 9 yards. The Serenity Cove HOA was suing me for, wait for it, illegally dumping sewage into Miller's Lake, thereby contaminating their properties when the lake flooded. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of it left me breathless, then chuckling. They were suing me for dumping the sewage that they had been dumping for months. It was a masterpiece of projection, a legal strategy so brazen, it was almost admirable in its foolishness. Their claim was that I had somehow, through unspecified means, introduced vast quantities of raw sewage into my own lake, timed perfectly with the heavy rains, specifically to harm them. They further alleged that my operation of the dam was negligent and malicious, designed to cause the contaminated water to flood their properties. My lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Albright, whom I'd retained as soon as I saw this storm brewing, actually laughed out loud when she read their complaint. "This is rich," she said, "even for an HOA. We prepared our defense meticulously, or rather, our offense, because we had a mountain of evidence to turn this farce on its head. We had my months of photographs and videos of their illegal discharge pipe in operation, long before the flood. We had the preliminary lab results showing sewage contamination emanating from their side. We had the official reports from the EPA and the county health department, which, spurred by my persistent complaints and now the visible catastrophe at Serenity Cove, had finally concluded their investigations and unequivocally identified the illegal pipe as a source of untreated wastewater from the Serenity Cove development. Their report even cited a lack of proper permitting and multiple code violations for that particular piece of rogue plumbing. It was a smoking gun, or rather, a smoking pipe. In my deposition, I calmly recounted the entire history, my discovery of their pipe, my attempts to reason with Carol Jenkins, her dismissive attitude, their continued pollution, and finally, my entirely legal and historically justified management of my dam during a period of heavy rainfall to prevent broader downstream issues. When their lawyer, a rather smug fellow who clearly thought he was dealing with a simple country bumpkin, tried to grill me about weaponizing the lake, Ms. Albright gently interjected. "Counselor," she said, her voice smooth as silk, "are you suggesting that my client, by managing his own lake on his own property using a dam that has existed for a century, is somehow responsible for the contents of the water your clients illegally discharged into that lake? Because if so, the logic is somewhat circular, wouldn't you say?" The deposition of Carol Jenkins, I heard, was a legendary meltdown. Faced with our irrefutable evidence of her HOA's illegal dumping, the photos, the videos, the official EPA report, she apparently alternated between indignant denial, blaming disgruntled contractors, and outright panic. When Ms. Albright presented enlargements of the motion camera footage showing Serenity Cove maintenance personnel near the active discharge pipe on multiple occasions, not fixing it but clearly aware of it, Carol's composure reportedly shattered. She tried to claim the pipe was for excess storm drainage, until Miss Albright asked her if storm drains typically carried used toilet paper and E. coli. The judge, bless his common sense, granted our motion for summary judgment on their claim of me dumping sewage. He essentially ruled that there was no genuine issue of material fact. The evidence overwhelmingly showed that Serenity Cove, not me, was the source of the sewage. He even made a rather pointed comment about frivolous lawsuits and the wasting of court resources. That was one down. But Carol Jenkins and her rapidly imploding HOA weren't done. Their pride, and presumably their insurance company, wouldn't let them quit. A few weeks later, I was served with a second lawsuit. This time, they were suing me solely for the flooding. Their argument was that, regardless of the sewage, which they now grudgingly, implicitly, had to concede wasn't mine, I had maliciously and negligently operated my dam to cause flood damage to their properties. They claimed I had a duty to manage the lake levels in a way that never impacted their development, regardless of rainfall or my historical water rights. This, Ms. Albright explained, was a slightly trickier, but still very winnable case. Our defense here rested on two main pillars: my absolute and historical water rights, and the principle of coming to the nuisance. My deeds and the century of precedent clearly gave me the right to manage the dam and the lake levels on my property. We provided expert testimony from a hydrologist who confirmed that the lake level rise, given the recorded rainfall and the partial sluice closure, was within expected parameters for proactive flood management, aimed at preventing a more catastrophic downstream dam failure if the lake overflowed uncontrollably. He also testified that my actions were consistent with the documented purpose of the dam. The coming to the nuisance argument was also potent. Serenity Cove had been built years after my lake and dam were established. They had knowingly built on a floodplain, adjacent to a managed body of water. Their own developers and engineers should have accounted for potential fluctuations in lake levels, especially during heavy rain. Ms. Albright presented evidence that the developer had, in fact, been warned by county planners about the floodplain designation, but had managed to get waivers, likely through cutting corners on proper grading and storm water management infrastructure within Serenity Cove itself. We showed how their own inadequate internal drainage and excessive impermeable surfaces, all those lovely paved driveways and roads, had exacerbated the localized flooding. The trial for this second lawsuit was more involved. Carol Jenkins took the stand and tried to portray herself as the victim of a vengeful neighbor, painting me as a recluse who resented their beautiful new community. Ms. Albright, during cross-examination, was a marvel. She calmly dismantled Carol's narrative piece by piece. "Ms. Jenkins," she asked, "isn't it true that your development was built on land designated as a floodplain?" Carol tried to equivocate. "Well, there were some studies." "Isn't it true," Albright pressed, "that your own illegal sewage discharge pipe, lacking a backflow preventer, was a primary conduit for contaminated water to enter your properties when the lake level rose?" More stammering and evasion. "And isn't it true, Ms. Jenkins, that my client repeatedly tried to warn you about this illegal discharge, and you dismissed his concerns, even calling his property rustic and accusing him of harassment?" By the time Ms. Albright was done, Carol Jenkins looked like a deflated balloon. My testimony focused on my family's long history with the lake, our commitment to responsible stewardship, and the documented rights I possessed. I explained that my adjustments to the sluice gate were a measured response to heavy rainfall, intended to regulate outflow and prevent a worse scenario. I never once mentioned wanting to flood them with their own sewage, of course. I simply managed my water. The jury deliberated for less than a day. The verdict, in my favor, again. They found that I had acted within my rights and had not been negligent. The HOA was responsible for its own poor planning and the consequences of building in a vulnerable area. The sense of vindication was immense. Twice they had come after me, and twice they had failed spectacularly, their own misdeeds exposed for all to see. The legal battles had been stressful and expensive, even with Ms. Albright's skill, but the outcome was worth every penny and every sleepless night. Carol Jenkins and the Serenity Cove HOA had learned a very public, very expensive lesson. Don't mess with a man's lake, especially when he holds the key to the water level and has the law, history, and a boatload of their own stinking evidence on his side. The fallout for the Serenity Cove HOA was, to put it mildly, catastrophic. Losing two high-profile lawsuits, especially when the details of their own illegal sewage dumping and subsequent self-inflicted contamination became public knowledge, shattered any remaining credibility the board particularly Carol Jenkins, might have had. The residents, already furious about the sewage flood and the massive cleanup costs their HOA dues were now undoubtedly skyrocketing to cover, were incandescent with rage upon learning the full extent of the board's negligence and malicious legal gambits against me, which had only added to the HOA's financial woes. I heard through the grapevine, which was buzzing with schadenfreude, that emergency HOA meetings were held, filled with shouting, accusations, and calls for resignations. Carol Jenkins, the formerly imperious queen of Serenity Cove, was reportedly subjected to a barrage of abuse from her own neighbors. Her reign as the neighborhood dictator was over. Within a few months, the entire HOA board had resigned or been forced out. A new, considerably more humble and chastened board was elected, tasked with the Herculean job of cleaning up not just the literal mess, but also the financial and legal disaster left behind. Their insurance premiums, I imagine, went through the stratosphere, assuming they could even get coverage for willful pollution and subsequent self-ownage. Many of the affected homeowners in Serenity Cove, those whose properties had been directly inundated with the sewage-laced floodwaters, were rumored to be exploring their own legal options, not against me, but against the original developer for shoddy construction and against their own former HOA board for gross mismanagement and exposing them to such a biohazard. It was a beautiful cascade of consequences, all stemming from their initial arrogance and disrespect. As for Miller's Lake, well, it needed help. The sewage dumping, even if it had been temporarily returned to sender, had taken a toll. The EPA, finally galvanized into more than just report writing, issued a hefty fine to the Serenity Cove HOA and mandated a comprehensive remediation plan for any residual contamination from their illegal pipe, which was, of course, now permanently and officially capped under agency supervision. I, too, undertook my own efforts to help the lake recover. With the legal battles won and my rights firmly reestablished, I invested a significant amount of time and money into restoration. I consulted with environmental experts on the best ways to improve water quality, manage algae blooms that had resulted from the nutrient overload, and restore the natural balance of the ecosystem. We introduced beneficial bacteria, aerated sections of the lake, and carefully replanted native aquatic vegetation along the shoreline to act as natural filters. It was a slow process, but gradually Miller's Lake began to heal, the water started to clear, the unpleasant odors dissipated, and slowly the fish and other wildlife began to return in greater numbers. Watching the dragonflies dance over the water lilies once more, without that underlying fear of what horrors lurked beneath, was a profound satisfaction. My relationship with the new Serenity Cove HOA board was cautious. They approached me, cap in hand, a few months after the legal dust settled. Their new president, a mild-mannered accountant named Arthur, seemed genuinely contrite and eager to establish a more neighborly relationship. He apologized profusely and sincerely for the actions of his predecessors. He even asked for my input on how they could be better stewards of the land adjacent to my lake, a startling contrast to Carol Jenkins's dismissiveness. We actually had a productive conversation. I explained my non-negotiables, primarily no pollution, respect for my property lines, and an understanding of my water rights. Arthur agreed to everything. He even proposed they contribute to a fund for ongoing lake monitoring, a gesture I accepted as a sign of good faith. Life returned to a new normal, a more peaceful, more respectful normal. I still managed the sluice gate, of course, especially during heavy rains, but now, with the added, quiet satisfaction of knowing that my neighbors, chastened and educated, understood the importance of not fouling the water that lay so close to their homes. The story of the Serenity Cove sewage flood, as it became known locally, served as a potent, if somewhat odorous, cautionary tale about HOA overreach and the consequences of underestimating a quiet neighbor who simply wants to be left in peace to care for their own. Sometimes, if you push someone too far, you find out they have far more control over your immediate environment than you ever imagined. And sometimes, the best way to deal with people who are determined to dump their problems on you is to find an elegant, legally sound way to return those problems directly to their doorstep, preferably with a bit of added moisture. If you're out there dealing with your own version of a neighborhood dictator or an HOA that's lost its collective mind, remember to document everything, know your rights, and don't be afraid to stand your ground. Sometimes the most satisfying victories are the ones where your opponents are comprehensively undone by their own arrogance and misdeeds. And believe me, watching justice prevail, especially when it's served with a side of perfectly executed, karma-laden irony, is a uniquely rewarding experience. Drop a comment if you've ever had a David versus Goliath or a battle of your own. I'd love to hear your stories.